Next up is Michael Flessner. Michael is going to give us the next two presentations. The first talking more on the specifics of how do you actually select herbicides with multiple effective sites of action.
Glad to be with everybody this morning. Greetings from Blacksburg, Virginia. Really appreciate Dr. Vollmer breaking down herbicide resistance for us there. It's pretty amazing all the ways that weeds can kind of overcome the different herbicides and management tactics we throw at them. And so it's good to get an understanding of that. Like Dr. Vollmer mentioned, I'm going to try to shift from that to what do we do about it? How do we fight herbicide resistance with other management tactics? But this morning, I'm really going to focus on herbicides themselves. And so how do we fight fire with fire, right? How can we best optimize our herbicide program to mitigate herbicide resistance that might already be in our field or from developing within that field? And really one of the key things we'll learn is it's all about multiple effective sites of action.
So Michael, we do have a quick question. Are there any examples of weed species becoming resistant to pre-emergent herbicides?
So there are examples of that. I'll go ahead and answer it. There's certainly we have resistance to atrazine in some of our smooth and maybe red root pigweed in the region. And so atrazine has soil residual activity. It also has post-emergence activity there, but that's an example of one of these. There has been group 15 resistance reported in some of the pigweed species out in the Midwest. So that would be products like Dual, Outlook, Warrant, or Residua. And there's also resistance to our group 3 herbicides, which would namely be Prowl. So there are examples of resistance to both pre-emergence and post-emergence herbicides. But it's a good question. Dr. Vollmer, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I was going to say that the resistance to group 15 herbicides, such as S-metolachlor, that is another good example of metabolic resistance that has developed.
Good point there. Great. All right, we'll keep moving. So I think, when we look at how can we fight herbicide resistance and manage that, it's really the first thing we have to do is recognize that no herbicide is infallible or unbeatable. We've got to watch closely for changes in weed control because weeds are going to constantly adapt to any pressure, any tactic we put out there, whether that's herbicides or otherwise. And so we've got to select our products and tactics based on what's there and the need that's there, not on our routine, right? Just because it worked last year doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work again this year. So we've got to recognize that herbicides can be beaten by weeds and carefully guard against that. So to do that, we've really got to have a solid plan in place. And this is a plan that I think is something we need to spend time on this over the winter and spend a couple of days on, not something we can really think about once the spring is here and we're rushing to get ground ready and crops in the ground and all that kind of thing. It's going to take some time because there's a lot of nuances here that we'll see here as we go through this. So one of the ways we can do this is to try to rotate herbicide sites of action which is easily identified through their group number. And as Dr. Vollmer pointed out, just because we're rotating herbicide products doesn't necessarily mean we're rotating the way that those herbicides kill the plant, right? So the group number identifies the way it kills the plant. And if we rotate group numbers rather than products, then we will be rotating herbicides. And the frequency of the rotation is a key factor. The longer we can move away from a herbicide before we come back to it will help us, and we'll see that as we go here. We also want to use multiple effective sites of action, and we'll talk about what that is. But it's basically just if you're getting into a scuffle, it's always good to have a buddy there to help you, right? Rather, so you have two ganging up on one is better than just one-on-one. Your odds of winning there are much better. So we want to use multiple effective sites of action. That can add cost, but oftentimes we see that either using a prepackaged mixture that has multiple effective sites of action or tank mixing products to get there will improve the effectiveness as well. So we're going to have better control and we're going to help mitigate herbicide resistance. We have to apply full rates or full effective rates of the herbicide. That seems fairly straightforward, intuitive, but we'll see a couple examples where it may not be. And then, as we mentioned, herbicides, sole reliance on herbicides is not going to provide a complete answer to the herbicide resistance problem or any troublesome weed. We're going to have to include our non-chemical integrated weed management methods. So why is this important? I want to kind of go through these series of slides to kind of look at back up and kind of get a big picture for why this is important. And I thought I was going to be able, yep, I'm going to put a link to everybody in the chat box here. This is a series of slides that that Dr. Pat Tranel really developed at the University of Illinois, showing what's going on here with the development of herbicide resistance. So this is, we have a repeated and exclusive use of the same site of action. And so we have it across a number of years here, starting in year 1. And if we put out, that single tactic out there, that single site of action by itself in year 1, and then again in year 2, again in year 3, we see that the frequency of those individuals in that population, it starts out at a very low level and really kind of stays pretty low, but then all of a sudden it explodes and we'll get 10 to 100% of the individuals in that population being resistant. And that's really where we see the breakdown early on. But when we apply that herbicide, that selection pressure, it's going to increase the frequency of those individuals in the population. So when you look at this is a hypothetical graph here, and we're seeing that we really kind of have a disaster by 10 applications or 10 years later. And I think that's fair. When you look at different herbicides from the time they're commercially launched to the time one weed species, not all weed species are going to develop resistance, but by the time one weed species develops resistance, it's typically between 5 and 15 years. So 10 years is about right. So this is the case if we're repeatedly and exclusively using the same herbicide site of action. What happens if we compare that to rotation of herbicides with the fitness penalty? And so what we see is year 1, when we use the herbicide, we have that same increase of frequency of resistant individuals in the population as we did with the repeated exclusive use. But in year 2, we rotate away from that, and we actually see a slight decline in the frequency, and that's because of the fitness penalty. A fitness penalty is when the herbicide resistance mechanism makes the plant that has that mechanism just less competitive, right? Less vigorous. And so you can imagine if it is a photosystem inhibiting herbicide and the resistance mechanism allows that plant to still complete photosynthesis, right? It's resistant to the herbicide, but the photosynthesis process is a little bit less efficient. It's not going to be able to capture as much energy from the sun, so it's not going to grow as big. It's not going to produce as many seeds, right? So it's going to when that herbicide is not applied, the individuals in the population that are susceptible to the herbicide that don't have the fitness penalty produce more seed, and so it goes down a little bit in the population. Year 3, we go back to that herbicide and it rises back in the population, and so on and so forth. The problem with this example is that most of our resistance mechanisms do not have a measurable fitness penalty. So what we actually end up with is really in that year 2, when we rotate away from that site of action, the individuals in the population neither go up nor down. They just remain the same. And so this is largely the case with the resistance mechanisms that we are aware of at this time. And so what you see is just this stair step. And so we get more years or number of we get more time, but we don't necessarily get any more applications by rotating herbicide sites of action. We just, instead of putting those all out in one application per year across 10 years, we put the same 10 applications every other year. So it took us 20 years to get there. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's certainly a good thing, but it doesn't really get us where we want to go, which is getting more applications. And so how do we get more applications? Well, when we apply 2 effective sites of action in the same application, that is where we get both time and number of applications. And so that's what the black bar here is. And so that's what's critically important to do. But so the take home message is we both want to mix and rotate. So how do we do that? I think it's important to recognize where these group numbers are on the herbicide label. So here's a Roundup label, and you can see, hopefully it might be a little bit small here, but group 9 herbicide right there on the product label. Some herbicides are prepackaged mixtures, and it can be a little bit more complicated. So here's the product Acuron. It has 4 herbicides in it, or active ingredients. It has S-metolachlor, atrazine, mesotrione, and bicyclopyrone. And you can see on the herbicide label, it tells you which each of those are. Atrazine is a group 5 herbicide, bicyclopyrone is a group 27, mesotrione a group 27 as well, and S-metolachlor is a group 15. So despite there being 4 herbicides in this product, there's only 3 sites of action: a group 5, a group 27, and a group 15. And so knowing which of these herbicides actually was killing the weed of interest is sometimes difficult to find on a label, right? If we're trying to target Palmer amaranth with this weed, the product will tell us that it's controlled, but we don't necessarily know if that's controlled by the atrazine, the mesotrione, the S-metolachlor, what it is. Here's an example of why that can be important. And I'm trying to use real world examples here of products on the market. I'm not picking on any product specifically. I think for all these examples, there's multiple products I could choose from. So I want to make that point clear. I don't think there's anything necessarily, better or worse with any of these herbicides. We just need to find the right herbicide for what our situation is. Okay, so here's Valor XLT. Valor XLT has 2 sites of action in it, 2 herbicides, a group 14, that's Valor or flumioxazin, and a group 2 herbicide, which is chlorimuron, which is the product Classic. So here we can see that the Valor XLT did exactly what we wanted to do. There's no weeds in this pot, and so we're seeing that it worked, but we don't know which of those herbicides in the product actually resulted in the control. Here's the result from Valor, the group 14 flumioxazin, and also we see no herbicide or no weeds in the plot, meaning that this group, this site of action was effective against our target weed. But here is the chlorimuron by itself, and we can see that there are weeds in that pot, and this is likely due to ALS resistance here, which means it would be ineffective, right? But a herbicide can be ineffective from resistance or from tolerance, as Dr. Vollmer mentioned. So regardless, there's weeds in that pot, this is ineffective. And so really, despite applying 2 sites of action in this prepackaged mixture, only one of those is effective against our target weed. So just because there are multiple sites of action in our tank or in a prepackaged mixture does not mean they are all effective against the target weed. And that's what's critical in terms of creating a herbicide plan that is going to mitigate herbicide resistance. The active ingredients, the herbicides, have to be effective. So let's continue with this. Here's Authority First. This is, as you can see on the product label, group 14 herbicide plus a group 2 herbicide, sulfentrazone and chlorantranilimethyl methyl. We can see on the product label that, and I'm just highlighting weeds here. I think these were ones that were pretty identified as problematic by the group earlier in the webinar. But it's going to say this is Palmer amaranth is controlled, horseweed or mare's tail is controlled, and common ragweed is controlled. There is an asterisk there, and that indicates that it will not control ALS-resistant biotypes of these weed species. So this label gives you a little bit of a clue. You have to know that ALS means a group 2 herbicide, and so that the group 2 may be ineffective, but you also have to know, again, if you have ALS-resistant weeds in your field. So where can you find this information? Part of it you can find is on the label, as we mentioned. You can also look up the site of action at takeactiononweeds.com, and I'm going to put I'm going to try to put a link in there in the chat box to that. And then there's also in our Mid-Atlantic Field Crop Weed Management Guide, we have this information along with different tables that allow you to break down prepackaged mixtures and see if each of those constituent products are effective or not. So let's look at how we do that. So here's a table out of our pest management guide, and we were looking at authority first, I believe. And so if we highlight that one, this table tells us that authority first has the same two products the label told us and the rate that's there, group 14 and a group 2. But if it also tells us that if we apply it at this rate, a common rate, 6.45 fluid ounces per acre, it's going to deliver this amount of single active ingredient products, right? So Spartan is sulfentrazone by itself. First rate is chlorantzolan by itself. And so that tells us the rate at which we're applying those herbicides and what is in that authority first product. So then if we go to the table, another table in our guide, the relative effectiveness of soil applied herbicides and soybeans in this case, when we can look at those two constituent products there that's in authority first. So you can see here's first rate or the group 2 herbicide, and we have efficacy ratings for the various weeds that may be in your field. And the same thing for Spartan or sulfentrazone down below, various ratings for those weeds that may be present in your field. And these are all based on research from myself and the other weed science specialists in the region in our herbicide evaluation trials. The scale on this is N would be either less than 55% control or no control. So we do not recommend those. And all the way up to a 10, which would be effectively a 100% control from that product. And so what we consider effectiveness to be is an 8 or better in this table. So let's look at some of these problematic weeds here. Here's the column for the weed Palmer amaranth, and you can see the first rate has an N next to it, meaning no control, and the Spartan has a 9, so it has about a 90% control is what we would expect to see from that product. And so that gives us one effective site of action from this. For horseweed, first rate would deliver a 9 is what we would expect, and Spartan an 8+, and so those both over 8, and so we have 2 effective sites of action there. And again, that's exactly what we're looking for. Another common weed, problematic weed for us is common ragweed, and there we have a 9 and a 7. Now the 7, I don't want to add confusion here, but the 7's, it's not an 8, so we're not going to consider it fully effective, but it's still pretty good. And when you look at the other examples there for common ragweed, that's a tougher one to control pre-emergence. So I'm going to end up giving that a 1+. Now, one thing to remember in all 3 of these species in the region, we do have widespread group 2 resistance, right? And first rate is a group 2 product. And so when you consider that if we have ALS resistance or group 2 resistance in our field, those 9s really are no longer effective. That's if they were susceptible. And so if we lose that as an effective site of action, this authority first product would drop down to a 1 here and sort of a 0+, right? We have some activity from Spartan against to slow down common ragweed, but not a fully effective rate. Okay. Let's go on and we'll try to break this down in another way. And then after this example, we'll have some polling questions here to see if I'm doing a good job explaining this or not. I'm going to put a couple more links in the chat box here on some videos that explain how to do what I'm about to do here. If you want to check those out later, they're there for you.
And Michael, we had a question come in.
Sure, that's a good time for it.
Yep, and so the question is, would you get a synergistic effect on horseweed with this product?
So certainly, we do get synergism when we combine certain herbicides together. And we can also get antagonism when we combine some herbicides together, and then sometimes we just get an additive effect. And so I think what we've seen is if there's an antagonism, usually that's listed on the label, and you definitely want to guard against that. but whether it's additive or synergistic, right, greater than additive effect, it's still beneficial for us. Either way, you're going to probably get better control than what one of those active ingredients by itself would get, and it's going to be better for herbicide resistance. So I don't know on authority first if you would see synergy or an additive effect if both of those herbicides are effective for your horseweed population. But I think either way, it's beneficial. I hope that answers the question. I guess it's also important to recognize that if you have resistance, though, you're certainly not going to see a synergistic effect because you only have one of those herbicides is doing the work. Only one is effective. Okay, so here's an example of another way we can try to calculate effective sites of action. So here is our target weed is going to be common ragweed. And we're going to consider this to be a susceptible population, despite in the region we have widespread group 2 and group 9 or ALS and glyphosate resistant to this weed. We're looking at this in corn. In pre-emergence, we're going to come out with Bicep 2 Magnum, and then post-emergence, we're going to come back with atrazine and glyphosate. So let's break those two things down. Bicep 2 Magnum is a prepackaged mixture of atrazine and S-metolachlor. And so there are, if you look on the label or in our pest management guide, you'll see that atrazine is a group 5 site of action, and the S-metolachlor is a group 15 site of action. So there are two different sites of action there. So we have two sites of action in that application. When we look at the number that are effective, right, we have to go to the dual, which is the S-metolachlor and the atrazine, to see if those are effective. And what we'll find there is that only one of those sites of action are really effective against common ragweed. The group 15, the S-metolachlor, while it does a lot of good on a lot of weeds, it doesn't quite get to that 8 or better for common ragweed. It's more of a 6 or 7, and I would think probably a 6 for common ragweed. So it's not considered effective. So the only site of action that we applied there that was effective is that group 5 atrazine. So we go ahead in the season, corn's up and growing, and we come back over the top post-emergence with some more atrazine and glyphosate. So if we look those products up, whether on their labels or in the pest management guide, we'll see it's a group 5 is atrazine again that we learned earlier, and glyphosate or Roundup is a group 9. And so we have a 5 and a 9, so there's two sites of action in the tank. And we look at if both of those are effective. On this population that's glyphosate susceptible, they are both effective. So we put out 2 effective sites of action there post-emergence, which again is what we're shooting for, at least 2. We look across the season total. You can't necessarily add this column up. 2 plus 2 equals 4, not 3. So the 3 here is that we had a group, we put out a 5, we put it out twice, but we only can count the 5 once. We put out a group 9 and we put out a group 15. So 5, 9, and 15 are 3 different sites of action, and we end up with 3 put out there across the season. Again, just because we put those out doesn't necessarily mean they're effective. And so we look at effective sites of action, we put out 2, and that was the group 5 and the group 9. Okay. All right, so let's dive into this example a little bit more. Let's consider that this population of common ragweed is resistant to glyphosate and ALS inhibitors. Glyphosate, again, is group 9, ALS is group 2. So come out with the same herbicide program here, Bicep 2 Magnum pre-emergence followed by atrazine plus glyphosate. We've already looked and seen what these numbers are. So let's look at the effective sites of action. Well, this didn't change. We don't have group 15 resistance. Really what we have there is tolerance, as Dr. Vollmer explained. And so we still have the same 1 effective site of action there pre-emergence. But we do have a change on the post-emergence application. The group 9 there, the glyphosate, we have resistance to. So the only site of action that we put out that was effective in this case is the atrazine or group 5. And so then when we look across the season on our effective sites of action, what we put out there is is 1 effective site of action, right? And that was the group 5 pre-emergence followed by the group 5 post-emergence. And this is really the recipe for developing herbicide resistance, right? And that's frequent, exclusive, and repeated use of the same exact herbicide in this case, but the same site of action, which is a group 5. Okay. So here we're going to get into our first poll to see if hopefully we're learning this. And this is going to be an example of common ragweed. We're going to consider this susceptible population. And for pre-emergence, we're going to put out Valor. Post-emergence, we're going to put out Flexstar GT. And so if I can, so I've launched poll number 1, and I hope there is enough information and space on your screen to do this. But so there's 3 questions in this poll. The first is, what is the site of action number for Valor? And so you can choose between a 1, a 9, a 14, and a 27. The second question of the poll is how many sites of action are in Valor? So 0, 1, 2, or 3. And then the third question is how many effective sites of action are in Valor? And so I've included some information at the bottom of this slide from our pest management guide. Just kind of cut the table to where you can see Valor. You see we have a column here for the site of action number and a rating for common ragweed over here of an 8+. I'm going to go ahead and end the polling here and share the results with everybody. And so the answer to the first question, what is the site of action number for Valor? It is a group 14. Looks like most people got that one correct. The second question, how many sites of action are in Valor? There's just one. It's just a group 14. There's not any other groups in that product. And most people got that one correct. And then how many effective sites of action are in Valor? There's just one effective site of action. We get an 8+ rating here. And so I think for the most part, we did very well there. And so we'll do the same thing here with our post-emergence application. I'll launch this poll here. And same series of questions for this, except that I need to show you Flexstar GT there. Okay. So the poll is up. Flexstar GT is, I don't have this information, but I'll tell you, it is a combination of glyphosate and a reflex or Flexstar. So glyphosate and fumicillin. So you can see the mixture score there, and you can see the constituent products above it there on the bottom of this slide. So the first question, again, is what is the site of action numbers for Flexstar GT? Second question, how many sites of action are in Flexstar GT? Then the third question, how many effective sites of action are in Flexstar GT? All right, I'm going to end polling and share the results. And again, we had a lot of correct answers here. So Flexstar has a group 9 and a group 14 in it. So the 9 plus 14 was the correct answer. How many sites of action are in Flexstar? There's 2 of them, and 85% scored on that one, or got that one correct. And then how many effective sites of action are in there? In this case, there are 2 effective sites of action. There was some saying that there was only 1 effective site of action there, about 35%. And I'm going to guess that comes maybe from a glyphosate resistant population or group 9 resistance. But we are considering this to be susceptible there. All right, so I think everyone did very well.
Flessner, we have a couple really good questions.
Okay.
So the first one, if a product has a rating of 8+ or 9, does that indicate that the uncontrolled weeds of concern are potentially resistant, or would it be due to other factors?
No, that is a great question. So 8+ or 9, the ratings are based on what we see in our research plots if everything goes correctly, right? So if we had good environmental conditions for pre-emergence, we had activating rainfall within a reasonable amount of time, we had good spray coverage, et cetera, right? Not a drought, not a washout with rain either. And that's rated 3 to 4 weeks after the application. And that's relative to doing nothing, a non-treated check plot. So in some cases, like a residual or a pre-emergence herbicide, an 8 or 9, it might be tolerance, right? There might be some just natural tolerance there. I think that's probably more when we get down to the 7s, 6s, or Ns that I would consider that to be tolerant. But it might also be that those weeds came up later, right? So if we're rating that 4 weeks after the application went out, that herbicide, is going to start to dissipate, right? And so the rate of herbicide that plant was exposed to, if it tried to emerge 3 weeks after the application, is a lot less than if that plant had tried to emerge, the day after application and activating rainfall. So it might be that the herbicide is wearing off if it's a soil residual herbicide. From a post-emergent perspective, it might have been a little bit bigger, right? And so a bigger weed has a less effective dose than a smaller weed at the time of application. So it could be a lot of different things, but we wouldn't necessarily rate these on resistant. These are ratings that come from, unless one of these footnotes in the tables that I'm not showing here, but there are some footnotes in the table that mention herbicide resistance. And so like one of the horseweed or mare's tail and the common ragweed labels footnotes is going to tell you that we have widespread resistance to ALS or group 2s and glyphosate in the region. So it's just kind of how we would expect the herbicide to perform. I think we've got to for effectiveness, have to make a cutoff somewhere, and we, the weed scientists in the region, feel good about an 8. So I hope that answers the question, but certainly a really good question there.
Thank you, Dr. Flessner. Yes, it was. And the next question, also a very good question. If there is a herbicide product with several sites of action and the targeted weed is resistant to at least one of those site of actions, would it be recommended that the product not be used in that field?
So that's the classic extension answer of it depends, right? If you did have multiple effective sites of action, so Acuron was a product we put up earlier, right? And so it has 3 sites of action in it in 4 different herbicides. And so if you had resistance to, let's just say, the atrazine component of that, and you're looking at something like smooth pigweed, then I would expect that the other 2 sites of action, either the group 27s, mesotron or bicyclopyrone, would be effective, as well as the S-metolachlor component of that. So even though you have resistance to one of those sites of action in that product, there's still 2 effective there. Now that's an example where there are still 2 effective sites of action. You could easily have, this is the other part of the it depends, is if you have a product that you has on a susceptible population had 2 effective sites of action, but then you have resistance, and so you really, instead of putting out 2 effective sites of action, now you have 1. That's where you may want to look at a different product that has 2 effective sites of action, or the alternative is you might look for something you could add in the tank with that product to get to 2 effective sites of action. But and we'll look at some more examples as we go, but another really good question. Are there others, or is that all for now?
Nope, we're good for now. Yep.
Okay, great. So the next poll here is to look at the season total in this this example here. And so I will launch the next poll here. So the first, and so we're trying to fill in the season total row here, excuse me. So the first question is that first cell there. How many sites of action were applied across the season? 0, 1, 2, or 3. And the second question is how many effective sites of action were applied across the season? So the first cell here, how many sites of action were applied across the season? About 70% of us said there are 2, which is the correct answer. About a third of us, or 30%, said the answer was 3. And so again, you can't just add this column up. 1 and 2 doesn't necessarily, it would equal, 3, but 2 of those were the same side of action, right? So really we applied a group 14, we applied it twice, but we can only count 14 once. And we applied to group 9. So we applied 2 total sites of action in the season. How many of those were effective? Again, the majority got the correct response, about 2/3 of us, that there are 2 effective sites of action there. We can't count the group 14 twice. All right, let's go to the next one here. We're going to change this just a little bit. Now we have group 2 and group 9 resistant population of common ragweed. Again, this is what we usually, in my experience, have seen across the Mid-Atlantic region. So I'm going to launch the next poll, and there's just one question on this poll. So we didn't move anything as far as the pre-emergence application. So we still have, the same Valor. Group 14, one effective side, or one side of action in the tank, and that is effective. But now, because we have resistant population, has this cell changed? How many effective sites of action are in FlexStar GT when we have a group 2 and 9 resistant population? There's one effective site of action there. Because we have group 9 resistance, that's not effective, and so we're relying on group 14 there. To carry the weight. So there's only one effective site of action in this example. All right, how about across the season? So again, we still put out those 2 total sites of action across the season, but how many were effective? So I'll launch this poll. There's 2 questions here. How many effective sites of action were applied across the season? And then a follow-up question, is this a good strategy to fight herbicide resistance? True or false? I'm sorry, it's a statement. This is a good strategy to fight herbicide resistance. And again, the majority of the responses were correct here. How many effective sites of action were applied across the season? Now there's just 1, all right, and it's just that group 14 herbicide, because again, the 9 was not effective here. So we have just a group 14 applied, and it was applied twice in that season. So the answer to the second question, the true or false statement there, is false. This is not a good strategy for herbicide resistance. We put out a group 14 pre, and we followed that by the only effective site of action is another group 14. And so we're relying exclusively and repeatedly on that group 14 to fight common ragweed in this case. And so that's a recipe to get herbicide resistance if there is one there. So that's not a good strategy there. Okay. So I think these efficacy tables can also be used to help us look for, if we don't have, and this is sort of a follow-up to one of the questions earlier, is if, okay, we don't have at least 2 effective sites of action in the tank, how can we get there? Well, one way would be to tank mix a product, or we can look at this to see, is there a prepackaged mixture that would provide 2 effective sites of action? So I've highlighted Palmer amaranth and common ragweed here. And for Palmer, you can see that there are several different pre-emergence herbicides, soil applied herbicides in this case. We have these same tables for post-emergence in soybeans and the other crops as well. But you can see we have several group 14s, group 15s, and metribuzin, a group 5 herbicide, is one that can also be added to the tank to get us another effective mode of action. So I think metribuzin is one that it is in some prepackaged mixtures, but if it's not, it's one I think we should be considering adding to our herbicide portfolio in soybeans as a pre-emergence, because it's fairly inexpensive and is a good tank mix partner for Palmer amaranth control. When you look at common ragweed, that's one it's a larger seed. It's harder to control from a soil applied residual herbicide perspective. So you see fewer 8s and above over here to choose from. But there is one, the old Lorax or Lennox, a group 7, and we don't have very many 7s here on the list. You can see would be one that you might consider adding there to get multiple effective sites of action for common ragweed. All right, so let's look at another example here. I've highlighted lamb's quarters, and I'm going to launch another poll at you here to see if we can use this table to get to an answer here. All right, so here's the next poll, which provides at least 2 effective sites of action against lamb's quarters. All right, and so the options are glyphosate, glyphosate plus first rate, glyphosate plus Basagran, and first rate plus Basagran. All right, I'm going to end the polling and share the results here, and 85% got this one correct. So glyphosate only has 1 site of action, and so it's not going to be 2 by itself. When we add first rate to it, we have a group 9 and a group 2, as you can see in that site of action column. So we have 2 sites of action, but when we look at the effectiveness score for first rate, it's an N, and so that's not effective. Whereas the glyphosate score is an 8+, so you'd have 1 effective site of action there with glyphosate plus first rate. When you look at glyphosate plus Basagran, you have an 8+ for glyphosate. Basagran is an 8. And importantly, it's not the same site of action as glyphosate. There's a 6 and a 9. So that is the correct answer. There's 2 effective sites of action in that combination. The last answer there, first rate plus Basagran, is kind of like the second one, glyphosate plus first rate. It only delivers 1 effective site of action, and that's Basagran. Okay, similar question here, but we're going to look at common ragweed this time. And we're going to call this glyphosate and ALS, or groups 2 and 9 resistant common ragweed. So which of these herbicides tank mixtures provides at least 2 effective sites of action against group 2 and 9 resistant common ragweed? So the options are glyphosate plus first rate, glyphosate plus Basagran, glyphosate plus Enlist 1, and Liberty plus Enlist 1. And while people are thinking about that, I guess one important point to make here is that we have to make sure we have the right genetics to use the herbicide in that crop, right? So if we're going to use Ingenia or XtendiMax, we need to have an Extend or Extend Flex soybean. If we're going to use Enlist 1, we have to have an Enlist soybean. And Liberty is going to have to be a Liberty Link GT27, Enlist, or Extend Flex soybean. So one of the soybean varieties that has glufosinate or Liberty tolerance, right? So with that caveat aside, assuming we have the right genetics in our field, that we're not going to kill our crop, what's going to best kill the weed? I think everybody, for the most part, got the correct answer here. So glyphosate and first rate, if we look at those, so here's glyphosate, it's listed as a 9, but we have group 9 resistance. And so glyphosate is not an effective site of action for a glyphosate resistant population. Similarly, for first rate, we have a 9 listed there, but this is a group 2 resistant population, and that's what the site of action for first rate is. And so first rate is also not an effective site of action. We'll look at the second option, glyphosate plus Basagran. We have an 8 there listed for Basagran, so that delivers 1 effective site of action. We do not have resistance in this population to group 6s. But again, we have the resistance of glyphosate. So similarly to that one for the third answer, glyphosate plus Enlist 1. Enlist 1 is an effective site of action, but the glyphosate is not. So we're still not up to the 2 effective sites of action against this population. So the last answer there is correct. Liberty plus Enlist 1 delivers 2 effective sites of action. We have Liberty, a group 10, which is a efficacy score of 9, so it's better than 8, so that counts. And list 1 is an 8+, and so that counts, and there's not resistance to either of those 2 in this particular population. So great job there. Okay, as you can see, this can kind of get more and more complicated, and certainly if we're considering that we're going to have more than 1 weed at a time in our population, we delivered these publications, and if you haven't received them yet, you should be shortly in the mail if you registered through the link, or in person. You should see these publications, and basically these 2 for common ragweed and palmer amaranth respectively, and soybeans operate under the assumption that we have glyphosate and ALS resistance, and there's tables at the end to help you look at what the other options are and how you can get to 2 effective sites of action. So hopefully these make it a little easier to calculate that, as well as providing some other information about good integrated practices, good non-chemical practices to incorporate there. I see there's another question here. Question was, how would you know you have a group 2 or 9 or any other group resistant population of a weed? Prior experience in that field, or you can just assume it is there because it is present in your state? So that's a great question, is how do you know if you have herbicide resistance? I think Dr. Vollmer had some good slides there on what it sometimes looks like in the field. But if you just rented this field for the first time and you really don't know what's out there, you don't have any prior experience to go by, and so that's where kind of want to tread lightly, right? And if your experience in the area is if glyphosate's not working on that weed, I wouldn't expect it to work in that field if I had no experience. Same thing for group 2 or any other group for that matter. If there's weeds, if there's a weed species in the area that has resistance to that, and you're just picking up a new field, I would operate on the assumption that you probably have resistance there, because I think that's probably what you'll see. So one of the common things that you'll see early on in resistance to the high level resistance stuff is you'll see individuals that were killed right next to and randomly mixed with individuals that were not killed. And so when you see that, and there's no pattern to it, right? So there's like Dr. Vollmer mentioned, there's a lot of reasons a herbicide can fail. So you've got to eliminate those. You had the right environment, there wasn't a sprayer malfunction, you had the right rate, the weeds weren't excessively large, right? They were within the size range as indicated on the label. All of those other reasons, if all those were right, then I think that's when you want to consider that herbicide resistance could be an option. And one of the ways that it shows up initially is a dead weeds mixed with alive weeds, and there's really no pattern to that. I would also say, if you don't know, you might get with your local extension agent or your state specialist to try to track that down further if you have further questions. I know that me and the others put this program together get a lot of these questions, and so I think we could help answer that. So another good question.
Hey, Michael.
Yep.
If I could jump in on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And totally agree with everything you said. I just want to let folks know that for some of the resistance, there is some genetic testing that's available, but it's for a very a limited number of herbicides and weed species that they can do a genetic test for. Most of that we rely on greenhouse screening, and which is unfortunately a cumbersome and can be kind of a long process. So there isn't for most of our species, there isn't a quick and easy test that we can do to check for resistance. But any time that you suspect it, I would, get in contact with your agent, as Michael said, and track it down. Thank you.
That's a great point. There is the University of Tennessee has a herbicide diagnostics lab. It's not, it's not a cheap test like a soil sample might be, but you can send samples to them and they will run it through that. I think the price range is from, depending on which test you want done, whether it's a molecular test or like a greenhouse assay, I think it ranges from about $1,600 to $3,000. And so there might be some sticker shock there, but I can tell you, I was working with a small grains producer, one of our better ones in the state of Virginia, and he had a problem with Italian ryegrass, and he had used Axial, a Group 1 product, and had resistance to that. Well, we happened to have a herbicide test in one of his fields, and the Group 2 herbicides, Powerflex and Osprey, both did a really good job on that. And so had he known that he had that resistance, even if that was $3,000 to find out, that would have more than paid for itself across the acres that he was farming that year. And so certainly next year he moved away from the Group 1 and went to the Group 2, as well as added Zidua or Anthem Flex pre-emergence, and got great control that next year. So knowing what you have is definitely a huge part of the battle. So it's important to try to track that information down, even if it does cost a little bit of time and money. Great questions. Please keep them coming. So the other thing we have to consider here is we have to get the right rate of herbicide, right? Even if we don't have tolerance or resistance, right? We have an effective site of action. If we put that out at a low rate, then it's not going to be effective. And so I'm kind of just looking at some examples here. Callisto post-emergence, 3 fluid ounces would be a sufficient rate of that herbicide for the weeds at that size indicated on the label. But for pre-emergence, we need more than that for that soil activity to really kick in. That's more like a 5.4 fluid ounce per acre rate. And so you kind of see some other rates here listed. And so, one thing we have to remember is that our pre-emergence rates are going to vary by soil type. So where I am in Blacksburg is a much different soil type than where like Mark Van Gessel is there in Delaware, right? Where we're going to have a much different soil type, and we might have different herbicide rates because of that. So when you look at this a little bit more, here are some like a Bicep type products in corn. 4 products here, Bicep 2 Magnum, Lumax, Lexar, Acuron. And at basically the rate range, or a common rate listed on that label, you can see the equivalent of the products that they put out here. So Bicep 2 Magnum at 2.1 quarts will deliver 1.33 pints of Dual 2 Magnum, 1.65 quarts of atrazine, right? Lumax is going to deliver that kind of 1.3 pints of Dual 2 Magnum that we consider sufficient. It's going to actually deliver more than that, but it's going to deliver 1 quart less atrazine than compared to Bicep 2, right? Lexar is going to pretty much get those same rates, and both the Lumax and Lexar are going to add Callisto to the mix. And then Acuron is going to be sort of like a Lumax plus the bicyclopyrone component of that. So when you look at these, it's important to recognize that the atrazine rate might be a little bit lower than it needs to be in Acuron or Lumax to be considered fully effective. All right, so how do we figure this one out? So we have a table, and this is just kind of chopped up because it's a large table and it'll be really hard to see on the screen. And I've probably done enough of that in this presentation anyway. But we have a table that shows different soil active herbicides and what the rate's supposed to be in there's a greater than 3% organic matter side of this table, but I think for our purposes, mostly we're there at 3 or less. And then of course, medium or fine texture. And you can see that some products, the rate stays the same. Some products, the rate is going to change across those different soil types. So let's look specifically down here, kind of cut off the table. Spartan, going back to our sulfentrazone example here, in a coarse textured soil, 6.0 ounces is the amount of Spartan or sulfentrazone that we want to deliver there for it to be considered fully effective. All right. So then we have this table that I showed earlier. Rather than trying to use this table, I'm going to try to break it down here like I did for the Bicep type products. So here's some rates for Authority brand products. You can see Authority Elite or Broadax at this rate, 28 fluid ounces is going to deliver this much Spartan and this much dual Magnum. Authority First is going to deliver 6 fluid ounces of Spartan, this much first straight, so on and so forth. So for my last poll here, this is a question of which Authority product delivers an effective rate of Spartan or sulfentrazone. And again, our target rate of Spartan there is 6 fluid ounces. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling here and share the results because it's an overwhelmingly correct response there. Authority First delivers that effective rate of Spartan there, but you can see that it might change here a little bit. So a Spartan rate for coarse textured soil, we had at 6 fluid ounces. Authority Elite here, we have it at 28 fluid ounces, but for a coarse textured soil, the maximum rate is actually 25 fluid ounces. And so this ratio that's in this product in a coarse textured soil doesn't allow for the full rate of Spartan to be applied, right? You start putting out a lot more dual to get the Spartan rate up to what you would need to be, and you get off label there. So this is where I think where that question of synergy can come into play, right? So we added the dual to the Spartan, and you can get some synergy there. But really, I think we look at it as, we being the weed scientists, is that we really want a full rate of both of these. And so sometimes these products, you get a less than a full rate of the products that are in there. But sometimes, like for Authority First, you get a rate that is sufficient for both the products that are in there. Yeah, so I guess I'd also look at Authority XL down here, 5.8. That's not very far from 6. And so I don't, we don't want to draw this line too hard, right? In that neighborhood is really what we're shooting for, and that gets pretty close there. All right, so this can be challenging, certainly for multiple species, and certainly, it's when we have to add in herbicides to get there, that's going to drive our cost up. And so it's easy for me to sit here and say you need to do this, but I think it's important to recognize that we may not be able to do that in every single case. And certainly, as we have more and more herbicide resistance, sometimes there just isn't another option to add in there, right? So I think one thing we need to do is consider the species and really focus on the weeds of concern, right? Our driver weeds, the ones that have the highest risk of not just herbicide resistance, but the highest risk for spreading and becoming more problematic on our farm. And so just general ranking those, palm amaranth and horseweed would be ones that have the high risk. Moderate could be horseweed as well, or common ragweed, but something low might be like giant foxtail. And so if you're designing a herbicide program and maybe it's just not real feasible to get multiple sites of action on one of these species, you might just, giant foxtail would be the one that doesn't get the multiple effective sites of action. The other thing is looking at weed emergence timing, right? You may say, okay, I'm going to put out 2 effective sites of action post-emergence, but I don't want to have to spend the money pre-emergence to do it. And I'm probably going to miss a large part of that population. So what does that look like? Well, if I'm coming out as a soil residual application in soybeans, I might be planting, and this is the case in Virginia fairly commonly, is that we don't have pulmonary amaranth emergence until maybe mid to late May in certain fields. And so if I'm putting out my burn down there or residual, at the 1st of May, and I don't have any emergence, I might want to just put out 1 effective site of action there, but make sure I have 2 post-emergence. And so certain things like that. Conversely, for common ragweed, that's an early emerging species. And so I really need to make sure I kill that in the burn down, and horseweed would be another example of this, that if I kill it in the burn down, I've really done myself a favor, and I have a lot less of that population that's going to emerge later in the year. So I'll have less to contend with later. So I might focus my attention early in the season, make sure I have two effective sites of action in the burn down for horseweed and ragweed, and design the program where post-emergence, maybe I'm less robust in that on that end of things. But the other thing with doing that is we can always scout, see what's there. If we need to add something in at that time, then we can. So the plan, having flexibility is important. I do want to end with some positive messages here, is that multiple effective sites of action is going to result in better control. When we did some herbicide tests on palmer amaranth, we have different size classes here. Certainly this is the one we want to target, 2 to 4 inches in size, but 2 to 4, 4 to 8, and 8 to 12. We looked at one effective site of action and across a range of herbicides. This was in a non-crop situation, so we didn't have the crop competition helping us, which is critical. So we didn't see maybe as good of ratings here as we would have liked, but this would have been something like Liberty by itself, 2,4-D by itself, dicamba by itself, etc. When we added effective site of action to that, you can see we got an increase in the percent control, and this was in this case adding famecifin or Flexstar Reflex to it. And it was significant in each of those cases. So at the proper size class, we got a 19% increase in effectiveness by adding that site of action, 23 and a 25% increase at those larger than labeled rates, labeled sizes of palmer amaranth. So it is bringing us value in addition to protecting against herbicide resistance. Same thing we saw with common ragweed here. We saw a bump in control, 14% increase at the right size class, and about a 20% increase at the larger than labeled rate size class. And so that I think really shows us that the multiple effective site of action does a lot for us. It helps better control the weed, and it helps protect against herbicide resistance. So to conclude, though, we got to remember there's a lot of other IWM integrated weed management tactics that we need to be using. Focusing on herbicides is important, and we need to get that right, and we need to spend some time to plan how we're going to do that right. But that's not an entire weed management plan. It has to include the non-chemical tactics as well. So that's what we're going to look at next week. So I hope you can join us next Tuesday, either the morning session or the evening session, to take a deeper dive into what those are and which of those works best for our most problematic weeds in the region. Do we have any questions? If you use a product with several sites of action and the target weed is resistant to at least one of those sites of action, couldn't using that product potentially help the targeted weed species become resistant to another site of action in that product? And the way I understand the question is a yes. So if you, like as we just saw with Flexstar GT, right, if we have resistance to glyphosate, the only effective site of action left is that group 14, the famecifin part of that product, right? And so we're only delivering the one site of action, and so that can lead to herbicide resistance as we've seen. So yes, I think it's definitely something to watch out for there. Good question.
As a follow-up to that, Dr. Flessner, maybe another way to look at that, for example, for palmer amaranth, if we were targeting palmer amaranth, take a product like Authority XL, which has sulfentrazone and classic, and we mix that with a metribuzin, and someone might do that just because of economics, the way the numbers play out, or perhaps there's a weed that they're going after with the classic. Is there any disadvantage, because we would still have two effective modes of action? Is there any issue with using a product where we know there's known resistance in that field? Are you following the?
Yeah, I don't think there is, because like I said, you're even if you don't use that, as we saw in that rotation example, if we didn't apply it, it's not that that's really going to go away in that weed population. Unfortunately, as far as we can tell, once we get resistance, it's pretty much here to stay. There hasn't been a way where we can just rotate away from it for, like, let's say 10 years and get rid of it. That might be the case with some of these newer resistance mechanisms, like some of the metabolism-based mechanisms, but the research so far shows that we can't really rotate away. It's going to stay there. So even if there's a resistance like to glyphosate, applying glyphosate, I don't think is really going to hurt us, right? I think we've got to acknowledge that there's a lot of other weeds out in the field, right? We're just looking at one weed at a time right now, but it's probably going to help us with some of the other weeds in the field as well. And so when you look holistically at it, I think the right answer would be exactly what you recommended, would be adding something like metribuzin to that product. But a great follow-up question.
Thank you. We did want to acknowledge support for this project, particularly the Maryland Soybean Board, as well as throughout the Mid-Atlantic, the University of Delaware, Virginia Cooperative Extension, University of Maryland.